Joe Biden is raising your taxes. And if you don't learn how to avoid these taxes, you're about to get soaked. In today's video, I'm going to show you the 3 most important changes Joe Biden is likely to make to our tax code. And I'm going to show you what you need to do to avoid paying a ton of additional tax. If you hate paying taxes, you got to watch today's video. Okay, so I'm going to make this video talking mainly to people that have an average income. And what I mean by that is people that are making between $50,000 and $150,000. There are obviously a lot of different changes. It's very complex, the other changes that Joe Biden wants to make. But the bulk of the changes that he wants to make will apply to people making $400,000 and up. But I'm going to zero in on the changes that likely apply to you and which apply to the bulk of people. Now, I'm going to be talking about the U.S. tax code in this video because I live in the U.S. However, I know I have a lot of overseas viewers, and this video will apply to you as well. Because of the deficit spending that's gone on in 2020 and the bailouts and the type of government spending that's going on, that hasn't just only happened in the US, that's happened in many other countries. So a lot of other countries are going to enact a similar tax plan to what Joe Biden and the Democrats are talking about doing. So even if you live in Canada, if you live in Australia or Europe, this video will apply to you as well. So let's talk about the 3 biggest changes Joe Biden is going to make and how you can avoid paying a ton of additional tax. The first change, and by far the biggest change that he's going to make, is raising business taxes, or as they're sometimes referred to, corporate taxes. Joe Biden has stated his intention is to raise the business tax to 28% at least, and possibly up to 35%. Now, just from what I've read on this, the research that I've done, it's very, very likely that they can get this passed and that the business tax will be going up to 28%, if not 35%. Again, this hasn't happened yet. Nobody knows for sure, but this is the most likely and the most impactful change. So this is what I'm going to spend the bulk of the time talking about. Now, I know what you're thinking. Dan, I'm not a corporation. I'm just a person. So if corporations pay more tax, then fuck them. I don't have to pay any more tax because I'm not a corporation. But what you might not realize is that the corporate tax will affect you in ways that you didn't really expect. The first way that the corporate tax is going to affect you, the most direct way that it'll affect most people living in the U.S., is through your 401k or your retirement plan. In your retirement plan, you have stocks or you have mutual funds, and the mutual funds are mostly stocks or made up of ownership in businesses. If taxes on these businesses goes up, the value of your 401k, of your retirement savings, goes down. It goes down today because people will expect to receive less profits in the future, and every year in the future, you'll be making less profit from these stocks and from these mutual funds. Now, a lot of people think that their 401k or their IRA is tax-free, but this is not true. You do pay taxes on your 401k and on your IRA. They're just paid at the corporate level and not at the individual level. So let me explain a little bit more how this works. So there are 2 types of companies, LLCs and S corporations, or what's called pass-through entities, and C corporations, or incorporated entities. For a C corporation, you pay double tax. You pay one tax when the corporation makes the income, and a second tax when they distribute the income. For LLCs and S corporations, you only pay one tax when you distribute the income. All of the stocks, all of the mutual funds in your 401k are made up of C corporations. That's, for the most part, the only thing that can be inside there. So that means that because it's in a tax advantage account, you don't pay that distribution tax, but you're still paying that first tax, the business tax, and you are still paying taxes on your 401k and your IRA. If business taxes go up, your 401k goes down. That's the simplest way to think about it. Business taxes will also affect you indirectly if you're employed by a C corporation, or if you buy products from a C corporation, some of that tax will be passed on to you. Now, the most important way that you have to know about to avoid this tax is your investments. If you have a 401k, if you have an IRA, if you're invested in any types of stocks or mutual funds, then this is going to be real important for you. If you plan on making these investments, even if you don't have them yet, you're going to want to pay close attention to the strategies on this next slide here. So let's talk about how you can avoid being soaked by higher business taxes. Number 1, invest in MLPs or master limited partnerships. Now, I know this sounds real complicated, but it's real simple, and I'll explain how it works right now. Master limited partnerships are a type of tax advantage company that doesn't pay the corporate income tax. Usually these are companies that are infrastructure companies, companies such as pipeline companies that transmit natural gas or which ship oil around from place to place. They might also be shipping companies or railroads or other types of infrastructure type companies, but most commonly they're pipeline companies. Now, the reason why master limited partnerships or MLPs can be a great investment is that they are not subject to this corporate tax. Even if Joe Biden raises that corporate tax to 60, 70, 80%, it don't matter. They're not paying that tax, and you're not paying that tax if you're invested in an MLP. Furthermore, if C corporation taxes go up, MLPs will not be paying that tax, and they'll have a competitive advantage over other C corporations. There are regular corporations trying to operate pipelines and other types of infrastructure and MLPs. My prediction is if there was a big increase in corporate taxes, MLPs will gobble up market share, and the value of your MLP shares will go up. I know it sounds complicated, I know it sounds intimidating, but investing in MLPs is just as easy as buying a stock or buying a mutual fund. Anyone can do it. It's super easy, and you avoid all corporate tax. So master limited partnerships, look it up and start investing in MLPs. Number 2, invest more money in mega cap stocks and less money in small cap stocks. What I mean by mega cap stocks are the biggest companies, companies with a market capitalization of 200 billion or more. What I mean by that type of company is think Apple, or think Google, think ExxonMobil, Berkshire Hathaway, Facebook, Netflix, the biggest of the big companies, the global giant companies that are at the very top of the stock market. Now, why do I suggest investing more in these companies and less in smaller companies? The reason is that companies like Apple and Google and Facebook are global, and they have sophisticated systems set up to essentially avoid paying almost all US tax. They're still going to have to pay a little bit, but they can really minimize it. And if tax rates increased, they're going to spend even more on shifting their income overseas, and they're going to spend more and more on tax avoidance, so that way these changes will not hit them very heavily. Furthermore, companies like Tesla, like Apple, and Google are very politically connected, and they can likely negotiate tax abatements. They can get away with things that people like you and I, or even say like a $1 billion company, could never get away with. So in my opinion, if corporate taxes go up, mega cap companies have a huge advantage, small cap companies, or companies with a market capitalization below $200 billion have a disadvantage. So more Google, more Apple, less small companies. Next, if you are able to do this, invest in LLCs and S corporations, or invest in private companies. Now, there are a variety of exchanges that you can use to invest in private companies. In my opinion, if corporate taxes go up, these become relatively more attractive. Again, remember, LLCs and S corporations only pay one tax. C corporations pay 2 taxes. If business taxes go up, it negatively affects C corporations, gives LLCs and S corporations an advantage. Now, here's the downside of this, investing in private companies. There are websites and exchanges and apps you can use to invest in private companies just as easily as buying a share of Google or Apple stock. However, these are typically only open right now to what's called accredited investors. To be an accredited investor, you have to meet certain net worth or income qualifications, where basically only the top 5 or 10% of people are going to meet those qualifications. Most people will not qualify. But fortunately, there's a loophole, which I've used to invest in these before I was an accredited investor. Most services that are only open to accredited investors are using the honor system. They're not actually verifying your income or verifying your assets. Now, of course, to say you're an accredited investor when you're not would be illegal. You should never do that, but I'm just telling you, it's the honor system, and nobody will ever know or get hurt if you say that you're accredited when you're actually not. Again, this is illegal. I cannot recommend that you do this for all the YouTube censors watching right now, but I'm just saying that's what I did when I was not accredited in order to get higher returns. So that's something which you could look into and consider doing as well. Now, here's the final and the most powerful way to avoid these business tax increases, which is to start a business. If you start a business after C corporation taxes have been increased, that will actually give you an advantage. Let's say that you're selling some type of widget. When you sell your widget, you only pay one tax, the tax when your business makes the income. But a C corporation competing against you has to pay double tax. One tax when they make the income, and another tax when they distribute the income. If C corporations go up, that just amplifies their disadvantage against you. Now, bigger companies may have other advantages. Maybe they're established brand, maybe they have a big payroll and equipment and things like that. But taxes are a very significant advantage that you have in your favor, and in my opinion, a very underrated advantage. If C corporation taxes go up, that actually makes it easier for your business to succeed because your competitors are at a disadvantage. So here's a few ways that you can avoid these tax increases coming up. Look into these a little bit more in depth, and these corporate tax increases don't have to negatively affect you. All right, let's talk about the next change. This is one that you might benefit from. There's going to be a $15,000 credit to first-time home buyers. Again, this has pretty big popular support from the research I've done. This is one of the changes that is most likely to pass. Everyone wants to help out home buyers, and everybody kind of views it as a positive thing that the price of housing is going up. So, how do you take advantage of this? So what most people would say is wait until this is for sure, wait until the credit is passed, and then buy a house to take advantage of that credit. That would be the logical way to take advantage of that home buying credit. But I would actually suggest something pretty different. In my opinion, I think this change is pretty likely to pass. Do your own research, look into this, but if you think this change is likely to pass, I would buy a home now, before that credit is put into place, if there's any way you can possibly afford it. And here's why I suggest doing that. If you buy the home now, you won't be getting the credit. However, you will be benefiting from future appreciation of that home. In my opinion, when this credit is passed, when it does become a for sure thing, people will likely overreact to it. This is going to be something that a lot of people will be excited about. It's going to be all over the media. People are going to be talking about this home buyer credit, and probably the price of the average home will go up by more than $15,000 from now to when the credit is passed. So because of this overreaction, you'll be better off buying a home now, getting the appreciation from the credit, and selling later, rather than directly taking advantage of the credit, in my opinion. So if you have some money, think about that. Buy a home now. In addition to this credit, increasing future home prices and kicking in a good amount of almost guaranteed appreciation for you, interest rates are at an all-time low. It's one of the best times in history to buy a home, so if you know where you're going to be for the next 3 to 5 years at least, seriously think about it. All right, so let's talk about the third change. More inflation, a hidden tax on your cash. This one isn't as completely likely to happen as the other two changes. It's not as set in stone, and there is some controversy about this. I'm going to explain in the next slide, though, exactly what inflation is, why I believe it's likely to happen, and how you can protect yourself against this inflation. So first of all, what exactly is this inflation thing? Inflation is essentially when the government prints more money and where the money you have is worth less. When you hear about a house costing $10,000 back in 1940, or you could go to the movie theater for a nickel and now it costs $10, essentially that is inflation at work. Over time, a dollar is worth less and less. Now, the stated goal of the Federal Reserve, the quasi-government agency that manages our money supply, is to inflate the currency at about 2% per year. That means that their goal is that every year you hold your money is going to be worth 2% less than the year before. And that's if they hit their goal. Sometimes it goes above the goal. Sometimes in the past it has gone to 5 or 10% in a given year. And there has been a large amount of inflation in the recent past. So let's talk about why I think there's likely to be more inflation in the next couple years. Number one, there's going to be a lot more deficit spending by the federal government. And what I mean by that is that the federal government is going to be spending more money than it takes in. Now, the federal government almost always spends more money than it takes in, but because of the events of the past year, of some of the massive bailout bills that the governments have had to do, deficit spending is going to go to a historically unprecedented level. Usually the government might spend 5 or 10 or 15% more than it takes in, but this year it'll probably be spending double what it takes in. Not just the US government, but pretty much every government around the world. It's well known deficit spending causes inflation. This makes it more likely your bank account is going to be inflated away in the next few years. Next, there's been more money creation. Now again, this is a very complex topic. There are actually different types of money that affect inflation differently, but basically the Federal Reserve has printed a whole bunch of money and let a lot of that money circulate out in the money supply. Again, because of that, this has already happened. It's very likely there'll be inflation in the next few years. But the biggest reason why I think there's likely to be inflation is that the Federal Reserve itself has stated that its goal is to run inflation over 2% for the next few years. So that means that it's not going to be a mistake if inflation goes to 2.5 or 3%. It is actually their goal to go over 2%, their traditional inflation target in the next few years. The reason why they're doing this is, number one, the federal government inflation rate has run below 2% for the last few years, so they want to run it above 2% to make up for that. And this is also going to allow the federal government to borrow more money, to print more money, and to keep interest rates lower for a longer time. So you can see why they want to do this and why it's in the federal government's best interest to keep inflation above 2%. Now, I don't want people to get paranoid here. It's unlikely that inflation will go to 100% or 50% or even 10%. But could it go to 2.5% or 3% or 4%? Yes, it definitely could. I mean, that has happened, and that's happened within the last 20 years. And if it does go to 3 or 4%, is that going to negatively affect your wealth? Yes, unless you do what I'm about to show you in these next few slides. So pay close attention. All right, so let's talk about a few things that you need to avoid losing money from inflation. Number one, don't hold cash. So obviously you need some amount of money in your bank account just to pay the day-to-day bills and to pay off your credit card or whatever. But you should actually figure out and calculate the minimum amount of cash you can possibly hold and only hold that minimum amount. Every other penny that you can get should be in investments. Even if there was no inflation, you should still do that because investments make you money, whereas your bank account makes you nothing. But when you expect a lot of inflation, it's even more important to do. Now, let's say if there's 3% inflation per year, every year your bank account is worth 3% less. But if there's 3% inflation, stocks will probably absorb that inflation, which means that they'll probably go up by 3% more than normal because of that inflation. So that's the reason why you got to minimize the cash in your bank account to literally the minimum amount that you can have. You can get money out of your investments in a matter of a few days, so you really don't need that much. Only hold the minimal amount of cash. All right. Number two, do not buy bonds or bond mutual funds. So what is a bond? A bond is essentially when you loan somebody money and they pay you back interest. It's pretty simple, and a bond mutual fund is essentially when a mutual fund company collects a lot of these bonds, packages them all together, and sells everybody a little slice of it. So that's basically what bonds are and what bond mutual funds are. And that's what you want to avoid in the next couple of years. The reason for that is inflation is terrible for the returns on most bonds. Now, yields on bonds are already at historically low levels. For example, as of the time I'm making this video, the Vanguard Total Bond Market Index will pay you about 2.5% interest. Let's say inflation is about 3%, as the Federal Reserve has stated it is its goal to make it around 3%. That means you're actually making negative 0.5% every year. You're essentially guaranteed to lose money every single year if inflation is that high. So there are type of bonds that are protected against inflation, and I'm going to talk about those in just a minute. But if you expect inflation, you should minimize the amount of bonds you hold and only hold inflation-protected bonds. All right, third thing to avoid. Don't buy gold. Now, a lot of people might be surprised by this. Traditionally, gold is thought of as a way to protect against inflation. But if you look at this in the past, gold hasn't done a very good job at doing that. During periods where the stock market went down or when inflation went up, gold did not really protect people. In addition to that, when you buy gold, it's not like a business where you're collecting dividends. It's not like a bond where you're collecting interest payments. Your gold just sits there and produces nothing. So because of that, gold doesn't appreciate over time like stocks do, and you don't get interest over time like bonds do. Gold will protect against inflation to some degree, but the disadvantages of gold as an investment are so bad that you should never buy gold under any circumstances, even if you expect severe inflation. Okay, so that's what you should not do. But here's what you should do, and here's how you can actually profit from moderate inflation. Number one, you buy stocks. Now, if inflation is 50% a year or 100% a year or 500%, buying stocks is not going to protect you. But if you look into this, if you do your research, you'll see that when inflation has been 3 or 4 or 5% per year, stocks have protected people pretty well. The reason for that is, if a dollar is worth less, businesses can raise their prices. Now, they might not be able to double their prices, but they could raise their prices by 3 or 4 or 5%, and most customers will absorb that without complaining. Stocks can protect you against moderate inflation, the type that we're expecting, and I recommend buying as much stocks as you're comfortable with in order to protect against this risk. Number 2, buy inflation-protected securities, or as they're sometimes called, inflation-protected bonds. Now, I said before that you should avoid most bonds, but these are the type of bonds that are protected against inflation that you would want to focus on. These are called Treasury inflation-protected securities. If you're just looking for the shortcut, just looking for the symbol to type in to buy, what you want to look for is VTIP. Vanguard Treasury inflation-protected securities. In my opinion, those are the best inflation-protected bonds to buy. Now, the reason why I recommend these instead of regular bonds is that as inflation goes up, you'll actually get more interest to make up for that inflation, and these bonds are protected against inflation. Now, let's say that the worst case scenario, the nightmare scenario happens, and there is 100% inflation. Let's say that these bonds are paying you 3% right now. Your interest rate payments would go up to 103% in that nightmare worst case scenario. Now, I don't think that nightmare scenario is very likely to happen, so you should only have a small amount of your investments in these inflation-protected securities. These also pay you a very low interest rate, so they're a very conservative, safe, low-yielding investment. So I don't recommend putting the bulk of your money into this. But if you're very conservative, if you want something that's completely protected against inflation, even nightmare scenario, 100% inflation, then inflation-protected securities are going to be the way to go. Finally, you could buy real estate. Now, this also ties into the home buyer credit. If you buy real estate, if you buy your own home, the advantage of that is that you can finance that at a fixed rate. Now, today, you can get mortgages as low as 3.5%. Some people are even getting mortgages as low as 3%. Let's say that inflation is 3% and you took out a 30-year loan at 3% interest. That means you essentially got free money. Yes, you will be paying interest, but you'll be paying it back with inflated dollars. When you look at it in real money terms, you're actually paying nothing for the loan. You're getting the loan for free. Now, that's a major argument in favor of buying a house. If inflation was 1%, you'd be paying a massive amount of interest. If it's 3%, interest payments are practically eliminated. Now, another reason why you might want to invest in real estate is not only for your own personal residence, but just as an investment. Again, you can take out a loan, maybe not as low of an interest rate, but you can still finance the bulk of real estate investments. Let's say that you invest in a property and finance that with a 5% loan. If inflation is 3% in the future, you're only paying 2%. And you got to do the math. You got to make sure all the other aspects of the deal make sense and that you really want to go into real estate. But if everything else makes sense, paying 3% less interest will massively increase your profit margins. So these are 3 ways that you can protect yourself against inflation and profit from inflation. If you're worried about it, I encourage you to employ these strategies. So, to wrap this video up, let's talk about the ultimate way to protect yourself against inflation and Joe Biden's tax increases: starting a business. If you want to start a business, now is the best time in history to do it. But if you start a business, you're going to need customers. And the best way to get your customers is YouTube advertising. Ask me how I know, because I've done it. And many other people have done it too. But if you try to advertise on YouTube without knowing what you're doing, you're going to lose your shirt. That's why I created YouTube Ad Management Black Belt. This is the world's best course in YouTube ad management. In this course, I show you in detail exactly how to set up YouTube ad campaigns. I show you what type of campaigns to create, how to create CPA, CPV campaigns, and every other type of campaign. I show you advanced targeting strategies. I'll show you exactly how to split test your ads and make your campaigns profitable over time. Start to finish, everything you need to know to set up money-making YouTube ad campaigns, I will show you in this course. I guarantee it will be the best course on YouTube advertising you have ever bought, or I will give you 100% of your money back. And I know that it will help you to grow your business. If you want to learn more about YouTube Ad Management Black Belt, check out the link in the description. If you use that link, then you'll get a special discount, which I'm making available to my subscribers only. So check it out and learn more about YouTube Ad Management Black Belt. If you like this video, I'd really appreciate if you give me a thumbs up, leave me a comment down below, let me know what you think, and share this video with your friends. It really helps me out a ton. So thank you for watching. I really appreciate it, and I'll see you next time.